You hear it all the time, and a lot of times it's a joke, but when there's usually a fishing joke, there's some truth to it underneath. But you hear about, like, I was out fishing in my spot, or you see the memes like, oh, I found my buddy in my fishing spot, and then I had to kill him. And there's always some joke to it, but there is some truth to it. A lot of anglers have preferred spots, and like usual, we are going to flip that on its head and talk about fishing the pattern and not the spot.
Welcome to the Level Up Fishing Podcast. I am Andy Cochran.
And I am Stormy Cochran, and we are the proud owners of GSO Fishing.
We want to come to you guys today, to talk about pattern development and all the different levels of that and what any of that even means.
Right? And this is a topic we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. And so we're not going to do that to you. Today, we're just going to start breaking down what is actually fishing a pattern and not a spot. So we're going to kick it off talking about beginner patterns.
Yeah, we get asked all the time, hey, we want to book a trip so we can come to your lake and learn all the lake trout spots. And it's like, okay, well, where we find them that day doesn't mean that's where you're going to find them tomorrow.
Exactly.
And obviously, after 17 plus years of guiding on the lake, I wouldn't have a quote spot left.
Right.
And so that has been a driving force for us, besides the lures, is education, angler education on developing patterns. I think that will take you so much farther in your fishing than learning anybody's spot at any one time.
Yes.
Understanding why a spot might be productive and expanding on that is going to do you so much more good down the road.
Yeah. So if you were just starting out, how would you start putting together a pattern?
So yeah, when you're first starting out fishing, kind of the base level pattern development is just understanding your species.
Yep.
So it can be the simplest thing, like go to Google and look up seasonal patterns of whatever species that you're fishing for.
Yep.
Or just look up, whatever Wikipedia or whatever says about your species of fish.
And if you don't have a species of fish, but you're going to a lake that Google information about that lake. What is actually in that lake that you can fish for during that time of year, and then break down your pattern from there. And it might be that you have to research multiple species, but we like to go at it from we're going out fishing for a specific fish.
And so basically what you're going to learn about and what you really need to pay attention to is what you learn about the seasonal patterns of every species. So what that means is, a big one is when they spawn, what their preferred water temperature range is outside of the spawn, and what their typical food sources are, what their wintertime habits are.
Mm-hmm.
Those are going to be like the major kind of big hitters for things that you need to pay attention to. So say I'm going to drive to Lake Powell in November. What kind of fish are in Lake Powell? Oh, there's stripers, largemouth, smallmouth, walleye, crappie, catfish, all this stuff. So maybe you want to go target stripers. And so you start researching stripers and you'll learn that there's saltwater variations and freshwater. So obviously you want to break that down. And then how does a freshwater striper operate?
Yeah.
When do they spawn? They're going to spawn in the spring, so you'll learn about that. So that is irrelevant if you're going in November. So what you want to learn about there is, what water temp do they prefer? So when you get to the lake, first thing you do is check the water temperature, and at least you have some kind of an idea where to start. Like, is the surface water temperature ideal for them? So that probably means they're going to be really shallow. And those fish, when you start researching, they pretty much just eat fish. So the primary food source is going to be shad. So then it's really important to understand what the shad are doing also, because when you find the bait, you find the stripers.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll research, what does a threadfin shad do at a certain seasonal change, like going from fall into winter? What happens to the shad movement? Because the stripers are going to be right with them. So when we talk about building seasonal patterns, this is what we're talking about.
And it sounds like a lot. When you sit here and talk about it, it sounds like, oh, geez, that's a lot. That's going to take a while. No, these Google searches take 10, 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't take very much to figure it out. On a perch example, they like structure and they like their habitat to have some kind of, like a sagebrush or a bridge or boat docks, those kinds of things. They like to be around structure. They don't go in the river because they're not very good swimmers. There's things like that that you can research habitat, water temps, where they're going to be at to give you a really good base to start with.
So as you kind of work through that whole beginner level, that really what that means is it gives you a baseline for, your real simple question, where should I go fishing? It's like, well, you probably already know where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
And so what sort of pattern do you need to learn about that these fish might be doing based on the season that you're going?
Yeah, because if you're going and you learn that they are kokanee salmon and it's in July and they're free roaming the lake, you know that you don't need to go like jig for them. So you rule that out. And you know that it's probably better to troll for them at that point. So you kind of rule out water and techniques that you don't need to focus on. Whereas like if you just like going and you just go to the lake and you're like, "Whoa, where do I even start?" Starting with 15, 20, 30 minutes at home doing that beginner research about the species helps a ton.
So then from there, you kind of move up the ladder to like a lot more advanced pattern development stuff. And this is really all the real like meat and potatoes of pattern building. This is something that pretty much has to be done on the water, on the fly for the most part. And, the things that you want to be aware of when you're really fine tuning a pattern are, it's going to be a lot of glossary of terms types things. Like, are they on the main lake? Are they in creeks? Are they in bays? Are they in pockets? And then one real important feature on any lake or reservoir to pay attention to is where the river channel is. Most reservoirs, they used to be a free flowing river that they put a dam on and filled it up, and now it's a lake. And so there's that old stream bed that flows from one end of the lake to the other. And there's still a lot of current that runs down that river channel year round. And so understanding how a fish might relate to that current is also a really important thing. That's probably like kind of the next thing after seasonal patterns. Once you start figuring out how fish should operate that time of year, is understanding where the river channel is and how that can position fish in the water column.
I think that Andy has a very unique gift when it comes to putting patterns together. Your brain is so technical, where I know this sounds crazy, but I'm like an emotionally based person. I know you just can't even believe it right now. But I remember when we first started fishing and you started explaining patterns to me and I was like, "What? From what? Like how did what?" Like it's a fish. I caught it on my hook. Look how cool that is. And you're like, "Yes, but why did you catch it? How did you catch it? Were you like jerk jerk pausing? What were you doing?" And I was like, "Whoa." Like there's this whole, I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it, but there's this whole like you don't see it, but it's happening at the same time. And it's really cool. I love that you kind of taught me that and opened my eyes that there's a heck of a lot more going on than just catching a fish. It's like how, what, why. So what do you call that?
So that's like a whole, it's a huge can of worms of stuff that I could go on and on and on. You know, when you first get on the water and you basically know where you're headed for the day and what you want to try to catch, how you want to try to catch it. There's this old saying that says, and this relates to actual catching a fish. 1 is an accident, 2 is a clue, and 3 is a pattern. So if you can put 3 fish catches in a row together that have some sort of relatable reason to them,
Mm-hmm.
then you're on to a pattern.
Yes.
And so I always harp on this with everybody when we're doing anything, but it's like you need to have very heightened situational awareness. So one example was we were fishing, me and Stormy one time, and Stormy loves to watch the birds and stuff, and every time she would see a bird flying around, she would like stop doing whatever she was doing on her technique and gawk at the bird, and then all of a sudden she would catch a fish. And after like the third time of that happening, she's like, "Oh man, every time I'm not paying attention, I catch something." And it's like that actually means a lot. Like, what does that tell you?
And I literally replied and I said that I shouldn't pay attention at all. And he was like, oh God, no, no.
It means whatever that technique you were doing required a very long pause in it to
Yep.
get the fish to react to it.
Yeah.
And so just being like, oh man, I threw a long cast and I had a backlash, and so I'm sitting there picking out my backlash, and as soon as I get it cleaned up and I reel it back up, all of a sudden my lure's swimming off. It's like, oh, I guess I need to let it sit there for a while.
Yes.
And let them think about it. So
That,
little things like that go a long way in helping you develop a pattern.
yeah, I really, it took me a long time to figure that out. I was just like, because like I've said countless times, I love the whole part of fishing. I love the nature aspect of it. I get distracted from time to time. Like you said, I like to gawk at the birds. But being present, you can still have a good time and love all the things about fishing. But being president? No.
Ooh, being present.
Being present in what you're doing and understanding what is going into you actually catching that fish and the next fish and the next fish is really important. And Andy does. He says situational awareness a lot because I'll be like, look at the bird. And he's like, situational awareness. it's a lot of fun that we have on our boat. So now there's an even more advanced pattern.
In the bass world, it's a big deal, the pattern thing.
Yeah.
And so you can do a lot of research on developing patterns for like largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, because that's the biggest, sector in the entire fishing industry is bass fishing. Mm-hmm. And so there's tons of info on that. Seasonal movements of bass, all the different sort of regional lures that seem to work better than, and it gets crazy. Like, you'll go to a tournament on the West Coast and these guys are throwing a Nico rig with a 1/4 ounce weight with a margarita mutilator 6-inch worm on 8-pound test with a 1/0 hook, and it's very, 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 very specific. And they throw that certain specific lure in one spot. Like they'll like have their trolling motor on high and they'll see a little point of grass sticking out on a tule line, and that's where they catch every single bite they catch.
That's incredible.
There's like a pattern within a pattern, and that's sort of like tournament level stuff. And so that would be, let's go to the California Delta, and we know that these big fish are like pre-spawn in the tules, and so that's kind of what you know.
Mhm.
But then from there, it's like where in the tules and what do you catch them on is the little things that you have to actually fine tune even more. So then it gets overwhelming. But I think it's worse in bass fishing than anything else.
Yeah.
Probably because of the amount of pressure that those fish face. Pretty much on any fishery in the whole U.S., bass are fished for all the time, and so it's probably a little harder to like super dial it in quickly because there's so many different little subtle things that you have to do different. But like in the trout world, it's a lot simpler. The bait selections are a lot smaller, and their seasonal patterns are a lot more directed. They're a lot more current related. There's a lot of things that simplify it once you kind of learn how trout operate.
Yeah.
And so, not to get you overwhelmed about it, but at the same time, if you can understand a certain pattern every day about even like a brown trout that you're fishing in a lake, once that all clicks for you, then you can be very, very like direct with what you're doing. Like you know what lure, you know how deep, you know where, you know how to fish it, and then it's basically like you just call your shots.
Yep.
You're like, I'm gonna throw this over there and I'm gonna catch one. And you do it.
Yeah. So beginner patterns start pretty much at home. They start behind your computer. It starts with research. It starts maybe YouTube videos on the species, things like that. But these advanced and tournament patterns is a lot more time on the water, it seems.
Yeah. And so as you level up through this progression of pattern building, besides the fact that it'll help you catch your target species more efficiently, the other thing that you're going to learn about pattern development is how quickly and how often patterns change.
Yeah.
And that's a super important thing too. Always your situational awareness of, especially like atmospheric conditions like wind, clouds, weather fronts, high pressure, all of that stuff. In certain species, especially like different changes in the weather can wreck your pattern pretty quick.
Yeah.
And so, understanding that part of your complete pattern, it has to do with everything put together. And so when one piece of that puzzle changes, it can totally throw off your whole pattern. And so, well, the fish were biting and then they just quit. I was like, well, what changed? What happened?
Yeah.
When that happens, then what?
We were fishing yesterday and the fishing was fantastic all day for hours and hours until the wind stopped. And then suddenly the lake was glass and the fishing, it didn't stop per se, but it definitely slowed down.
Yeah, it got instantly obviously tougher.
Yeah.
And so what needed to happen was like a technique or a lure change that the fish were still there. They were still active. They didn't move per se, but what we were doing to catch them changed. And so we had to change with it.
And so that kind of leads us to a question we get asked all the time. We get asked this all the time, and it's a really tricky question to answer. And that is, where should I go fishing? And the reason it's so tricky is because one, it's that guide stereotype, okay? If we sit there and we say, "Oh, you should take this lure and this thing and go use it at this exact spot and you'll catch all the fish." That's where I caught them yesterday. Well, you just talked about how quickly patterns can change. Maybe they last all summer, maybe they last a week, maybe they last an hour, and then they're over. And then as a guide service, we sent you to this spot and you go out there and maybe you're trying a technique you're not used to, or maybe the fish moved, or maybe you show up and there's 8 other boats on that spot. Then what do? Then it's like, as a guide team, you can get that stereotype of, oh, well, they told us the wrong spot to go fishing. Or so it's a really tricky question. And so that is why we started talking about how important it is to fish the pattern and not the exact spot.
And so that's why a lot of times, you will get a relatively vague answer,
Mm.
not because we don't want you to catch fish the way we are, or we don't want you to go to our spot. Like, it doesn't serve you the same way as, giving you a vaguer answer about what we're seeing generally as a pattern, like seasonally or, water temp related or whatever it is. Like, you'll even see it on our fishing reports. Like, hey, the rainbows are active from the surface to like 30 foot. And you're like, well, geez, that's pretty vague. And it's like, but it's true.
It
And
is.
it's like, but they might be active in the first hour at 10 feet, and the next 3 hours at 20 feet, and the last 4 hours at 30 feet, and then again at 10 feet, depending on if the wind's blowing or not, or if it's cloudy or not, or there's way too many variables to like, you can't like pin it down.
Right.
Even kokanee salmon are probably like the most patternable fish in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, if you're going to get, oh, we're catching them from 40 to 70 feet, which is true. But on certain days, you might catch them all at 50.
Yep.
But that same day, you might catch a bunch at 40 and a bunch at 70. And you got to change your speed. And then if the clouds come over, that changes everything again. And so
Or wind and
the only thing I
all
guess
of it.
that's sort of easier with the salmon is you're trolling large stretches of water, and so you can just go to like a basin
Yeah.
and troll around until you start getting around them. That's like a little bit easier, where some of these other more structure oriented fish get a little more specific.
And that is exactly why we try and explain what the pattern is in those areas. Like, yeah, we can give you a basin to try out for salmon in the summer, but like we've said over and over, what works for me might not work for you because we have a pontoon and you have a deep V boat. And, even our guide team sees it all the time. They are in constant contact when they are out on the water just to make sure everyone is doing well. And what works for one of them might not work for another. And Andy will be like, I got them all on a purple squid. And Randy will be like, well, I caught them all on a Taz. Or, it's completely different. So we try and give everyone a baseline to where you can be successful if you implement your technique. If you ask, where should I go fishing? Okay, what do you want to fish for? Where are you planning on going? Do you have a boat? And we kind of break that down from there to give you a better idea of what you can do with your situation.
Yeah, and the other part of that is, that whole saying that I always say too is like, I can't catch your fish and you can't catch mine. And that is so true in the fall, especially.
Yeah.
Pretty much nationwide. The more research you do on pattern stuff is like the fall of the year is probably the hardest time of year to develop like a really certain pattern sometimes, because there's so much more dynamic stuff going on. There's um like freezing weather moving in, crazy wind, then you get lake turnover. Some of these fish are spawn, some are pre-spawn, some are post-spawn, like browns, lake trout. And so that scatters fish around like crazy, probably more so than any other time of year.
Yeah. So if you're starting out, here are a couple of things. This can be overwhelming. And like we said, we could literally go off about this for a very long time. There's so much information.
Yeah, I like mention certain things, and you're like, what is that? What is that? Yeah, what's a channel swing? What's a outside, inside? Like, there's a ton of glossary of terms that need to be known and learned about. But like, say that we just want you to be aware of all of these things and start thinking about it.
Yeah, and just start with a little research and understanding, do the fish you fish for spawn in the spring? Do they spawn in the fall? What is their food source? What is their habitat? Just start with those things, and it gives you this great foundation to go from there. The other thing is write it down. because life happens. And between now and tomorrow, we're going to have 72 things happen. Somebody's going to forget that they have a homework project due by tomorrow morning. By the time you get home, you're already back in life. So even if you jot some notes down in your phone, even if you write it down in a notebook, we also have a fishing log that we created. And if you go to our website, gsofishing.com, and go to the show notes for this podcast episode, we will have a PDF download and it has all those things on it. It has wind direction, moon phase, all of those things, everything. It goes deep, but you don't have to start there. Just write down the things you see, the things you notice. Did you have to stop the lure when you were bringing it in for them to actually strike it? What was catching the fish? What did you notice? And just write it down. And then the next time, write a little more down. And then it'll give you a really good baseline going forward where you can look into those more advanced and tournament level patterns.
Yeah, so that download will be super helpful to keep track of all of the different things that we feel like are very important, long-term in pattern development. But like Stormy said, the big ones to pay attention to are, you'll research it beforehand, but the seasonal patterns of this fish. But when you're out on the water, pay attention to the wind or lack thereof. Mm-hmm. Pay attention to how clear is the sky or lack thereof. And the other one is water temp. And I know if you're like fishing from the bank, that's a little tough, but most fly shops carry stream thermometers that fly fishing guides use a lot to gauge water temps on moving water, and they obviously work just the same in a lake because like all of these things work the same in a river or a lake. A lot of river fish are like bug oriented rather than bait fish oriented or crawdads, and so if you're going to go fish a trout stream at a certain time of year, there's going to be certain bugs that hatch at certain water temps and certain times of day and certain light and certain cloud cover. So even rivers get that dialed in to patterns. And so it would probably serve you well to get a stream thermometer so you can always monitor the water temp. And then the last thing that can be researched before you go fishing too is we like to look at weather trends. So like the current weather kind of is what it is, but are you on a warming trend? Has the weather been very stable for 3 or 4 days in a row? Or did it snow like crazy and the barometric temp like pressure crashed yesterday and you're going to show up and it's super high pressure? Or vice versa. Like understanding trends in the weather, like on a weekly basis before you go, can tell you a lot about what to expect when you get there.
So we hope this was helpful. Again, we have a free PDF. It's a fishing log. You can go to our website, gsofishing.com, download your free copy, and write it down. Just use it as a reference, whatever you want to do. Take notes. Start out with your 15-20 minutes of research online about the species you want to target and go from there.
As we get from fall into winter, things are going to fall into like a very stable conditions as far as fishing goes and pattern development goes. Like winter patterns are probably the most consistent, especially if we're talking ice fishing, because cloud cover and that kind of stuff doesn't affect near as much, and your techniques are narrowed down. So
yeah,
going into ice season, this would be a great thing for you to really start paying attention to. How are these fish moving? Where are you finding them and why?
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Level Up Fishing Podcast.
We hope to see you out on the water.